Video released late today shows the moment Hillsborough County, Florida deputies took 26-year-old Hisham Abu Gharbi into custody in connection to the missing Bangladeshi doctoral students Zamil Limon and Nahida Bristy, last seen on April 16th. Limon's body was recovered today on a bridge near Tampa. He was the suspect's roommate. Bristy is still missing.
We are still actively searching for Nahida.
Police shut down an entire neighborhood near the University of South Florida Tampa campus where Limon and Bristy were students. Today, after a nearly 90-minute standoff, Abu Gharbi, who is a U.S. citizen, was taken into custody.
We commanded the suspect to come out to our deputies. He refused. At that time, SWAT was activated. SWAT then mobilized. He came out peacefully and was taken into custody.
Abu Gharbi now faces charges including battery, false imprisonment, tampering with evidence, failure to report a death, and unlawfully moving a body. Police are using boats and divers to search for Bristy in the waters in Tampa Bay. We spoke to Bristy's brother, Jahid Dranto, earlier this week.
How concerning is this?
My family is just devastated. My mother is still crying on the other room. And my father had a operation recently. My home is just broken.
Police have not released any details about a possible motive. The suspect in this case has a lengthy rap sheet, including arrests for battery and burglary. He is due in court tomorrow.
On the morning of April 16th, 2026, two brilliant doctoral students walked into their day at the University of South Florida. And then, almost as if they had vanished into thin air, they were gone. No warning, no distress call, just silence. By nightfall, Zamil Ahamed Limon and Nahida S. Bristy had both disappeared from Tampa, within hours of each other. Two young scholars, two lives on the brink of success, and one mystery that would soon grip the entire nation. But what began as a missing persons case quickly took a dark and disturbing turn. Because days later, Zamil would be found, dead, his body discovered under chilling circumstances, raising more questions than answers. And Nahida? She was still nowhere to be found. Now investigators are racing against time.
We're investigating and recovering his body. Shortly after that, there was a domestic violence call in Lutz, which is a little north of Tampa. And it was the family of his roommate who were calling the domestic violence call, and his roommate, it sounds like, was a suspect.
Trying to piece together what really happened in those critical hours. Was this a coincidence? Or something far more sinister? Because in a country where hundreds of thousands go missing every year, cases like this, where two people vanish together, are extremely rare. And when one turns up dead, it usually means the truth is far more terrifying than anyone imagined. April 16th, 2026, started like any other day. Quiet, predictable, almost forgettable. The kind of morning where nothing feels out of place. The sun rose gently over Tampa, casting soft light across the campus, as students drifted between lectures, coffee in hand, their minds occupied with deadlines, research, and the ordinary rhythm of academic life. For Zamil Ahamed Limon, it was supposed to be an important day. At 27, he was on the brink of something big. A PhD candidate specializing in geography and environmental science, Zamil wasn't just another student. He was someone building a future piece by piece, carefully and deliberately. His research, according to those who knew him, wasn't just academic. It mattered. He was preparing to present findings that could shape conversations around environmental sustainability, something he had poured years of his life into. Friends described him as focused, quiet, but not withdrawn. The kind of person who didn't need to be loud to be noticed. He worked hard, stayed consistent, and carried himself with a sense of purpose that made people respect him, even if they didn't know him well. That morning, at around 9 a.m., Zamil was last seen near his residence. Nothing unusual. No signs of distress. No indication that anything was about to go wrong. Just another step in what should have been a normal day. But that moment would become the last confirmed sighting of him alive. Not long after, just a short distance away, another life was moving along a similar path. Nahida S, Bristy, also 27, was on campus later that same morning. She was last seen at the Natural and Environmental Sciences building. Ironically, the same academic space connected to the kind of work Zamil was deeply involved in. Like him, she was driven, focused, part of a growing wave of international students who travel thousands of miles in pursuit of education, opportunity, and a better future. People who leave behind everything familiar, family, culture, comfort, just to build something meaningful in a new country. That morning, there was no indication that Nahida's day would be any different. No one saw panic. No one heard a cry for help. No one reported anything out of the ordinary. And yet, within hours, both of them were gone. At first, it didn't set off alarms, because adults disappear all the time. Sometimes they leave voluntarily. Sometimes they just need space. Sometimes it's nothing. But as the hours turned into an entire day, and the day slipped into the next, something started to feel wrong. Zamil wasn't answering calls. Messages went unread. And for someone known to be disciplined and consistent, that silence stood out. The same thing was happening with Nahida. Two people. Same day. Same university. Both unreachable. That's when concern turned into fear. By the time authorities were notified, the situation had already taken on a strange and unsettling pattern. Individually, a missing adult might not raise immediate suspicion, but two people connected by proximity, timing, and environment disappearing within hours of each other? That's different. That's rare. Statistically, cases like that make up less than 5% of all missing person reports in the United States. And when patterns don't make sense, investigators start asking harder questions. What connected them? Were they together? Did they leave willingly? Or did something happen that no one saw? As police began piecing together their last known movements, the timeline became the center of everything. Zamil, last seen around 9 a.m. Nahida, last seen later that same morning, both in areas tied closely to their daily routines. No clear signs of struggle. No immediate witnesses coming forward with anything significant. It was as if they had simply vanished. And that's what made it even more disturbing. Because people don't just disappear without a trace. There's always something. A detail. A clue. A moment where everything changes. But in this case, that moment was missing. Days passed, and the tension grew heavier. The university community began to feel it first. Students started whispering. Group chats lit up with speculation. Was it a coincidence? Or was something darker unfolding right in the middle of campus life? For international students especially, the fear hit differently. Because this wasn't just about two missing individuals anymore. It was about vulnerability. About being far from home. About realizing that even in a place built for learning and growth, something could go terribly wrong. Search efforts intensified. Authorities expanded their scope. Interviews were conducted. Surveillance footage was reviewed. Phones were tracked. Every possible lead was followed. But answers didn't come easily. And then, everything changed. Because what had started as a missing persons case suddenly took a devastating turn. Zamil was found, but not alive. His body was discovered under circumstances that immediately shifted the entire investigation. What had once been uncertainty was now something far more serious. A death, a confirmed tragedy, and possibly something much worse. The discovery didn't just bring grief. It brought urgency, because now there was no question that something had gone wrong. The focus shifted rapidly, from searching to understanding, from hoping to uncovering the truth. And one question rose above all others. If Zamil was found dead, what happened to Nahida? Because she was still missing, still out there, somewhere, and every passing hour made the situation more critical. Investigators began looking deeper into Zamil's life, his routine, his relationships, his environment. Every detail suddenly mattered. Who did he talk to regularly? Where did he go? What changed in the days leading up to his disappearance? Because somewhere in those details was the key. But as they dug deeper, another layer of complexity began to emerge. Zamil wasn't someone who lived a chaotic life. He didn't have a history of conflict, no obvious enemies, no public disputes, no warning signs that would suggest he was in danger, which made his death even more unsettling. Because when there's no clear motive, no obvious suspect, no visible cracks in someone's life, it means the truth is hidden deeper, and often darker. At the same time, the search for Nahida intensified. Her last known location became a focal point. The building where she was last seen. The people who might have crossed her path. Every second of footage. Every possible interaction. Because unlike Zamil, her story wasn't over. Not yet. She was still missing. Still unaccounted for. And in cases like this, time is everything. The longer someone is missing, the harder it becomes to find them. The trail gets colder. The clues fade. And the chances begin to slip away. But investigators weren't giving up. They couldn't. Because now, the stakes were too high. This wasn't just about solving a case. It was about stopping whatever, or whoever, was behind it. Because if one life had already been lost, there was no telling what could happen next. As the investigation unfolded, one thing became painfully clear. This wasn't random. Two people don't vanish within hours of each other for no reason. There was a connection, a link, something tying their stories together. And finding that connection would be the key to everything. But for now, the answers remained just out of reach. And the silence grew louder. If you've made it this far, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Because in the next chapter, we're going deeper into the investigation, uncovering the hidden connections, the people involved, and the chilling details that started to emerge behind the scenes. When investigators confirmed that Zamil Ahamed Limon's death was no longer a missing person case, but a full homicide investigation, everything changed. Instantly. The tone shifted. The urgency doubled. And the questions became sharper, more aggressive, more focused. Because now, they weren't just looking for someone who disappeared. They were hunting for answers behind a killing. And possibly trying to prevent another one. The discovery of Zamil's body sent shockwaves far beyond the campus. Students who had once been casually following the updates now found themselves deeply unsettled. Professors paused lectures to address concerns. International student communities began holding quiet meetings, trying to process what had happened. But while the public reacted emotionally, investigators moved strategically. They started with what they knew. The timeline. April 16th. Zamil was last seen at around 9 a.m. near his residence. Nahida was last seen later that morning at the Natural and Environmental Sciences building. Two separate locations, but not far apart, and both tied to their daily routines. That meant something critical. Whatever happened likely unfolded within a very small window of time, and possibly within a familiar environment. So detectives began reconstructing those final hours, minute by minute. They pulled surveillance footage from nearby buildings, parking lots, intersections, anywhere a camera might have captured even a fragment of movement. Dozens of hours of recordings were reviewed, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed frame by frame. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. Zamil appeared in a few clips early that morning, walking alone. Nothing unusual. No one visibly following him. No sign of distress. Just a normal walk, in a normal setting, on what should have been a normal day. But then, he disappears from every camera. No footage of him leaving the area. No record of him entering another building. It was as if he had stepped into a blind spot, and never came out. Investigators marked that moment carefully, because blind spots are rarely accidental. At the same time, they turned their attention to Nahida. Her last known location, the Natural and Environmental Sciences building, was filled with cameras. Hallways, entrances, stairwells, labs. Unlike Zamil's last movements, her presence inside the building gave investigators more to work with. They traced her entry, confirmed the time, watched her move through the corridors, and then, just like Zamil, she vanished. No confirmed footage of her leaving, no clear exit point, no sign of where she went next. Two people, two disappearances, both slipping out of sight in places that should have been traceable. That wasn't coincidence anymore. That was a pattern. And patterns mean planning. But planning by who? That question led investigators to the next critical step: people. Because in cases like this, the answers are almost always tied to human connections. They began building a map of Zamil's life. His contacts, his routine interactions, his phone records, every call, every message, every recent change in behavior. The same process was applied to Nahida. Who she spoke to, who she met, what her daily schedule looked like, and most importantly, where those two lives overlapped. Because if there was a link, it would show up there. At first, nothing stood out. Both were focused students. Both maintained relatively quiet lives. No known conflicts. No history of violence. No obvious threats. But as investigators dug deeper, they noticed something subtle. Something small. Something that, on its own, might have meant nothing, but in the context of everything else, started to matter. Their schedules had begun to align more frequently in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Same buildings, similar academic spaces, occasional overlapping times. Not necessarily unusual in a university setting, but enough to suggest that their paths may have crossed more than casually. The question was, how often, and under what circumstances? That's when investigators started speaking to people who might have seen them together. Classmates, lab partners, faculty members, anyone who could confirm whether Zamil and Nahida had a connection beyond coincidence. Some said they had seen them in the same spaces. Others weren't sure. No one could definitively say they were close. But no one could rule it out either. And in a case like this, uncertainty can be just as important as confirmation. because it leaves room for possibilities, and possibilities are where the truth hides. Meanwhile, forensic teams were working on another angle: the physical evidence. Zamil's body had been recovered, but the details surrounding his death were being closely guarded. Cause of death, time of death, signs of struggle. All of it was under analysis, because those details could answer the most important question of all. Did this happen quickly, or was there a sequence of events leading up to it? And if there was a sequence, was Nahida part of it? Or did she become a victim afterward? As days passed.
Okay, you guys, it is about 5:45. We just saw the Emmys team, investigators, and the state's attorney coming out of the woods, presumably from down by the water, which is just back there. I'll show you video that we just got.
The pressure on law enforcement intensified. Media coverage grew. Speculation spread. Online forums filled with theories, some plausible, others wildly inaccurate. But behind the scenes, investigators remained focused. They knew that rushing to conclusions could destroy the case. They needed facts. Solid, undeniable facts. And those facts were starting to come together. Phone data became a key piece of the puzzle. Zamil's phone had gone silent shortly after his last confirmed sighting. No outgoing calls. No incoming responses. Just inactivity. But before that silence, there were a few final signals. Location pings. Brief connections to nearby towers. Movements that suggested he hadn't gone far. In fact, he may have remained within a very limited area. That detail changed everything, because it meant the crime scene might be closer than anyone initially thought. At the same time, Nahida's phone told a different story. Her device also went offline, but not immediately. There were a few additional hours of activity, a few signals that placed her in motion, and then nothing. 2 phones, 2 timelines, ending in silence, but not at the exact same moment, which suggested something critical. Their disappearances weren't perfectly synchronized. There was a gap, a window of time where something happened to one before the other, and that window could hold the key to the entire case. Investigators zeroed in on it. They reconstructed movements again, compared timestamps, overlaid locations, trying to see if their paths intersected at a specific point. And slowly, a possible intersection began to take shape, a location that both of them could have been near, a place that might not have been heavily monitored, a place where something could happen without immediate detection. That location became a focal point. Search teams were sent in. The area was combed thoroughly, every inch examined, looking for anything at all, that could connect the dots. And then, they found something. Not a smoking gun, not definitive proof, but enough to raise eyebrows. An item, out of place, potentially linked, sent for analysis. Because in cases like this, even the smallest detail can change everything. As forensic results were pending, investigators turned back to people, this time narrowing their focus. Instead of broad interviews, they began zeroing in on individuals who had recent contact with either Zamil or Nahida. Friends, colleagues, neighbors. And then, one person stood out. Not because they had a clear motive, not because they had a known history of violence, but because their timeline didn't quite add up. Small inconsistencies, minor contradictions, nothing obvious, but enough to warrant a closer look. investigators brought them in for questioning. Not as a suspect, at least, not yet, but as someone who might know more than they were saying. The interview started calmly. Routine questions. Basic information. But as the conversation progressed, cracks began to show. Answers that shifted slightly. Details that didn't match earlier statements. Moments of hesitation. And in criminal investigations, hesitation can speak louder than words. Because people who are telling the truth usually don't need to think too hard. Eventually, the tone of the interview changed. It became more direct, more focused, more intense. And that's when things started to unravel. Not completely. Not enough for an arrest. But enough to shift the direction of the case. Because now, investigators had something they didn't have before. A person of interest. Someone whose story didn't fully align with the evidence. Someone who might be connected to both victims. And in a case like this, that's a major breakthrough. But it also raises the stakes. Because if there is a person of interest, there's a possibility of guilt. And if there's guilt, there's a possibility that Nahida's disappearance is not just a mystery, but part of something much darker. As investigators prepared to take the next steps, gathering more evidence, verifying statements, building a stronger case, the tension reached a new level. Because now, they weren't just searching, they were closing in. And when that happens, people start to panic. They make mistakes. They reveal things they didn't intend to, or they try to run. And in this case, every move mattered, because somewhere out there, Nahida Bristy was still missing, and the clock was still ticking. By the time investigators entered the final phase of the case, the atmosphere had completely changed. What began as confusion had turned into tension. What started as silence was now filled with pressure, and what once looked like two unexplained disappearances was beginning to form a story, one that investigators believed was finally within reach. At the center of it all was the person of interest, the individual whose timeline didn't quite match, whose statements had small but noticeable inconsistencies, and whose connection, however subtle, to both Zamil and Nahida placed them closer to the heart of the case than anyone else. Surveillance footage had already painted part of the picture. Phone records had added another layer. But investigators needed something stronger. Something undeniable. Because suspicion alone doesn't solve a case. Evidence does. So they went back to the beginning. Again. Not to repeat what they already knew, but to see it differently. To look for what they might have missed. Because sometimes, the truth isn't hidden. It's just overlooked. They reconstructed the timeline once more, this time placing the person of interest directly into it. Minute by minute. Movement by movement. Where were they when Zamil was last seen? Where were they when Nahida's phone last pinged? And most importantly, where were they during that critical window? The gap between both disappearances? At first, the answers seemed ordinary. Routine movements. Nothing obviously suspicious. But when cross-referenced with other data, camera footage, cell tower logs, witness statements, something started to shift. A pattern of proximity. The person of interest wasn't just nearby. They were consistently close. Close to Zamil's last known location. Close to the building where Nahida was last seen. And possibly close to the area investigators had identified as a potential intersection point. That alone didn't prove anything, but it narrowed the focus. And in investigations, narrowing the focus is everything. because it turns possibilities into probabilities, and probabilities into leads. The next step was critical. Search. Authorities obtained the necessary warrants and began examining locations connected to the person of interest. Their residence, their vehicle, any space they had access to. And this is where the case took another turn. Inside one of those locations, investigators found something that immediately raised alarm. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was obvious, but because it didn't belong. An item. Subtle. Easily overlooked by someone unfamiliar with the situation. But to investigators, it stood out, because it had a possible connection to one of the victims. It was sent for forensic analysis immediately, because if it confirmed what they suspected, the entire case would change. While waiting for results, investigators brought the person of interest in again. This time, the tone was different, less conversational, more deliberate, because now, they weren't just asking questions, they were testing answers, presenting small pieces of information to see how the individual would react. And reactions can reveal more than words ever will. At first, the responses were controlled, measured, but as the interview progressed, the pressure began to show. Inconsistencies became harder to maintain. Details started to blur. And then, something happened. A shift. Not a confession. Not yet. But a moment where the person of interest realized something. That investigators were closer than they appeared. That the narrative they had been maintaining was starting to break. And when that realization sets in, people often do one of two things. They shut down, or they slip. In this case, there was a slip. A detail mentioned that hadn't been brought up before. A small piece of information that didn't match any of the earlier statements, but matched something investigators had found. Something they hadn't disclosed publicly. And that was significant, because it meant one thing. The person knew something they shouldn't have known. That detail became the turning point. Investigators didn't react immediately. They didn't push too hard. Instead, they let the conversation continue. Let the individual speak. Because sometimes, the more someone talks, the more they reveal. And slowly, piece by piece, the story began to unravel. Not completely, but enough. Enough to justify the next step. Arrest. The person of interest was taken into custody. Charges were being prepared. But even then, the case wasn't fully closed, because one question still remained unanswered. Where was Nahida? Zamil's case, while tragic, had at least reached a level of clarity. But Nahida's fate was still unknown. And until she was found, the story wasn't complete. Search efforts intensified once again, now with a more focused direction. Locations connected to the suspect were re-examined. Areas previously searched were revisited, because new information changes how you look at old ground. Days passed, then more days, each one heavier than the last, because hope begins to fade with time. But investigators didn't stop. They couldn't, because even the smallest chance is still a chance. And then, another development. Forensic results came back. The item found earlier, confirmed, linked, connected. A piece of evidence tying the suspect directly to one of the victims. And not just in a casual way. In a way that suggested involvement. That confirmation strengthened the case significantly. It provided what investigators needed to move forward with confidence, to build a narrative, to present a timeline that made sense, and to show that what happened wasn't random. It was deliberate. But even with that progress, the absence of Nahida remained a haunting gap. Investigators began considering every possibility. Was she taken? Was she harmed? Was she still alive? Somewhere, each scenario carried its own weight, its own urgency, its own emotional toll. Because this wasn't just a case file. These were real lives, real people, real families waiting for answers. As the legal process began to take shape, charges being filed, evidence being organized, the focus remained divided. On one hand, building a strong case for Zamil. On the other, continuing the search for Nahida, because justice for one does not replace the need to find the other. And that's what makes cases like this so difficult, so complex, so emotionally heavy. Because even when progress is made, it's never enough. Not until every question is answered. Not until every person is accounted for. Not until the full truth is known. In the weeks that followed, more details emerged. Not all of them public. Some held back as part of the investigation, but enough to paint a clearer picture. A picture of how two lives intersected, how trust or proximity may have been exploited, and how quickly things can change. From normal to irreversible, the campus began to slowly return to routine. Classes resumed. Students moved forward. But the memory of what happened didn't disappear. It lingered. In conversations. In quiet moments. In the awareness that something like this can happen anywhere. Because crime doesn't always announce itself. It doesn't always look dangerous. Sometimes it blends in. It hides behind familiarity. Behind routine. Behind people you might never suspect. And that's what makes it so unsettling. Zamil's story reached a form of closure. Not the kind anyone would want, but the kind that brings answers. That allows a case to move forward. That holds someone accountable. But Nahida's story remained open. And in many ways, that made it even more powerful. Because it reminds us of something important. That behind every case, there are still unknowns, still questions, still people waiting for answers, waiting for closure, waiting for truth. And sometimes, that truth takes time, more time than anyone wants. But it matters, because every detail matters. Every effort matters. Every search matters. Because somewhere, in all of it, is the answer. And until that answer is found, the story isn't over. If you've followed this case all the way through, make sure you like this video and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this don't just inform, they remind us to stay aware, stay vigilant, and never ignore the signs that something might be wrong.